One of the things I've always wondered about is in the feeding of the 5,000, where did the actual miracle take place? Now, I know the miracle, the power of the miracle started with Jesus. But I always wondered whether the loaves multiplied in his hands or whether the loaves of bread multiplied in the hands of the disciples. I'd often thought that if the latter were the case, if the disciples actually got to feel the breads multiply in their hands, how weird that must have been. And when I read a translation like the NIV, there's not any help for this question. It says, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he, Jesus, gave thanks and broke the loaves, and he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. When I read this translation, it sounds to me like the multiplication happened in the hands of the disciples. Jesus blessed the bread, he gave the loaves to his disciples, and then no matter how many they gave out, they kept having more. And when I look at other translations like the ESV, NET, and NRSV, I see the same simple, he gave them. So it was a bit of a surprise to me in reading the CSB, where it says he kept giving them. I went, kept giving them? What's the Greek? Well, the Greek's an imperfect, a didou, something I never would have picked up from the NIV. So I looked around quite a bit to see if there was any way to read the imperfect as a simple gave. And what surprised me was that the commentaries I checked all said there's no clue in the text as to where the miracle occurred, whether it occurred in Jesus' hands or the disciples' hands. Well, I think an imperfect is a pretty good clue. When I looked over at the NASB, it's he kept giving them to the disciples. And in the NLT, he kept giving the bread to the disciples. So I don't know of any other way to read the imperfect other than imperfective in its aspect. And I think the CSB and the NASB get it right. He kept giving them to his disciples. So Jesus took the bread, he blessed the bread, and then he handed out a bunch of it to his disciples, and they came back to get more, and there was more. And they took them out, distributed, came back, and got more because he kept giving the bread to the disciples. I think it's the most natural reading of the imperfect. I'm hesitant to go against commentaries, especially when they seem to be unanimous, but I don't think you would use the imperfect to describe the single event of Jesus handing out the loaves to the disciples. I think it's a much more natural reading to think of a scenario in which Jesus gives out the loaves, the disciples distribute it, and they come back and he gives them more. They distribute it, come back, he gives them more. So I suspect the imperfect is saying that the miracle happened in Jesus' hands, which actually is pretty good theology, isn't it? So whether it's teaching or preaching or leading or serving or giving or whatever, that power ultimately belongs to the Lord.